Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of There's Will. I'm Will Richardson, your host, and with me in the studio is Philip Goss and Nicholas Richardson. No relation.
No relation, but still delighted to be here.
But close enough anyway. Yeah, good to see you too. Phil,
Thank
good
you.
to see you. How are you doing?
Well, it's been a heck of a couple of weeks here, hasn't it?
Yeah, a heck of a month. Heck of a month. And we got Harold von Kursk, our correspondent in the Baltics, who assures us that Estonia is still real after all these years. Harold, how are you?
I am doing fine. I wish a hail and hearty bula bula to my fellow panelists. And should you insult my girlfriends of the past, I shall resist the impulse to slap any of you.
Right. I've I hardly know. I suppose he's referring
He is, indeed.
to the Oscar incident with Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith and
Rock,
involving a fellow called Chris Rock.
Yes.
Chris Rock Star, I call him.
So, but the Oscars are a bit déclassé.
They're déclassé, are they?
Compared to our
The word of the day.
Yes, compared to our distinguished
Yeah,
program.
showbiz. It's funny to me. It's a good point, though. It's funny how that show business story took the headlines over, and everybody's worried about the nuances of why this moron walked on stage and hit someone.
But it's an event of the utmost insignificance, ultimately.
Yeah, the event is not that important, particularly in the light of events like war, mobilization of NATO, war in Ukraine, mobilization of NATO, inflation at record levels since the 80s, or even the 70s perhaps, depending on what the figures that come in next. Commodities through the roof, looking at shortages of certain food supplies, and so forth and so on. And I didn't even mention political correctness and all of the
Wokeness.
idiocies of
Yes.
idiocies of woke. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So that's where we stand. And not only is it, do you have snow in Estonia? Because we have snow here in Warsaw.
It snowed lightly a few days ago, but we've gone back to a cold phase. It's averaging between -2 and +2 for the last week.
Right. Well, we've had a snowstorm with several inches of snow, 3 or 4. And that was a nice April Fool's joke because, of course, 1st of April is April Fool's. And I thought it was very funny
Yes,
for us to have a big snowstorm on the 1st of April.
Appropriate, was it not?
Yes, it was appropriate. And you drove up from the south.
I did.
Because you've been along the border.
From Przemyśl, Rzeszów, Lublin to Warsaw. As I was coming up on Friday afternoon, it began to snow. And up to Lublin was okay for the most part, but between Lublin and Garwolin was just terrible. And I saw a few things off the road, and we were traveling 60, 70, 80 kilometers an hour for the most part. But then north of Garwolin, it seemed that the snowfall had not been as heavy. So,
Well, Garwolin is about halfway between Lublin and Warsaw. You drove about 400 kilometers, didn't you?
it's been quite a bit of driving the past
from the southeast
week.
corner.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was at Ustrzyki Górne and points even beyond that in the mountains of Poland at the Slovak and Ukrainian borders, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes. I mean, I think the thing that struck me lately is I was looking at, because you keep looking at the camera instead of looking at me. I'm wondering who you're talking to.
Not everybody's a natural.
Yeah. Maybe he's talking to Harold in Estonia, calling him up. The point is that it seems to me that there's been some kind of lull. There's some kind of lull. And not only the influx of refugees, because we have how many in the country? 2.5 million?
Yeah, 2.5, something like that.
Pushing 2.5 million. It's a lot of people.
It's a huge amount of people to have been absorbed so quickly.
Yeah, and not only that, but there appears to have been, there's this so-called Russian pullback. It's hard to know. They're still shelling, missiling Kiev and Chernihiv and other places, Kharkiv. A lot of this still goes on. But what's the situation, because you've been down there with the on the border with the different crossings, how do they look right now?
Well, the crossings are quite calm, it seems, at the moment. I've been from Hrebenene south to all those crossings, and indeed to a few places which are sometimes seasonal crossings for tourist times. In any case, not a lot of traffic coming through. The aid tents are there with capacity, but much of it is dormant, because if they don't have people coming through to cook for, there's no reason to be making food. And that's an important policy decision. One of the things I did notice at the crossing that comes into Ustriki Dolne is that they, after about 12 years, they reopened the rail connection from the border into Ustriki Dolne. So this is a standard European gauge track, but they're doing regular rail service now, because should there be another influx, and this is important because this is the southernmost crossing between Poland and Ukraine, so furthest from Belarus, they can move large capacities of people. If you count on 1,200 people per train, roughly, depending, of course, on how many cars we have. But if we had just 1,000 people and had a train every hour, that's moving a lot of people downstream to Ustriki Dolne. But then what do you do with such an influx of people at that location? Those logistics, I think, are a little more difficult, if it comes to that, than is the crossing from Medyka to Przemyśl or Korczowa.
Yeah, but Ustriki Dolne, I think when you start, first of all, these words can be hard for some people. Medyka, of course, is the main crossing where you can walk through, that's been on all the news.
That's the rail crossing from Lviv to Przemyśl.
Rail and walking crossing.
Yes, rail road.
It's a major crossing. It's important to stress both of those. And then we have also the crossing further south of Ustriki, which is into there. It's a Koshena, isn't it?
Something like that, yes.
I think Koshena. And it's quite a small crossing. And what did the people, you were down there, what did the people there say to you about the traffic through there?
Well, I asked about the traffic now compared to what it had been. And these were some aid tent workers. And their answer was that it's, of course, not nearly as much as it had been, but they are ready for more if it should come to that. So we have good capabilities of bringing people across, feeding them, making certain that they have clothing, and transport further into Poland. And of course, then you have another logistics question further downstream, but that's not a border crossing issue. That's a refugee issue.
Yeah, but anyway, there's this massive lull, and a lot of the aid has been moving over the border from Poland into Ukraine and into the area of Lviv, right?
Yes.
And I understand that the population of Lviv has skyrocketed as a result, rather like Warsaw's has.
Well, most of the internally displaced are going to Lviv and other smaller towns and cities around.
In that western area.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, but again, these places had seen significant depopulation of people leaving there for city jobs and city life. So I think there was excess capacity in the countryside that was used for resettling internally displaced refugees.
Yes, yes. Nicholas, what's the latest on NATO? You've been doing weekly reports.
Yes, we have.
Could you bring us up to date?
Well, yes. The main item of interest was, of course, the NATO summit last week, attended by the United States President, and the decision to create 4 more battle groups for the southern, the existing enhanced forward presence battle groups, which were established as a response to the Crimea annexation, invasion, call it what you will, in 2016, in the Baltic states and Poland, have now been extended to Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Slovenia, I think. Slovakia, yes. So that again, so NATO is then now defending this whole crescent, which faces the Russian east. So that's actually quite something.
Which faces the Ukraine.
Yes,
the Ukrainian plane.
Yes, where any attack or expansion or spreading of the war would come from. So that's actually very valuable, I think. Also, we've seen the continued flow of weaponry, NATO weaponry, particularly from the United States and the United Kingdom. And today there was a report of the first shooting down of a Russian helicopter by a weapon known as the Starstreak, which is the latest British Army weapon, which is interesting because it's actually It's almost, if you get
Tell us about this weapon and how it works.
It's very important because it's one which is hard to defend against, because most of these anti-aircraft weapons, they rely on the infrared heat from the aircraft engine, and so they can be fooled. This one actually requires the operator to have visual contact with the aircraft at all times, and so it's actually almost impossible to defend against. It's actually quite hard to operate, and normally you have to have had 1,000 strikes on a simulator before they let you have a go with a real one. But the British Army has been training Ukrainian operators, not in Ukraine, in an undisclosed location outside Ukraine.
So,
and it fires 3 darts essentially.
It fires 3, yeah.
And these are guided to their destination by the operator.
By the actual operator.
By the actual operator.
So it's not following that exhaust.
It's not following which is why it's actually very hard to defend against. Because if you're following the exhaust, then a plane can emit all sorts of things.
Flares, for example.
Flares and things which will trick this. But this one, it's harder to operate in that sense, but much more accurate if you have a good operator, and much harder to defend against. And the British Army, or the Ministry of Defence in London, believes that the film they've seen of this in action, shooting down a Russian helicopter, is genuine. And I gather that they've been very impressed with the speed with which they've been able to train Ukrainians to operate this. So that's a step forward. And this is just an example of how, when we hear of the Ukrainian president's request for weaponry, they are actually putting it to good use. But there is a limitation to what you can do with anti-aircraft missile. You actually begin to need some air force.
What's the NATO? Yeah, thanks. What does the NATO buildup look like right now? I hear there's as many as 100,000 U.S. troops. Can you give us?
I'm not sure how many U.S. troops. Right? I mean,
not here, but in Europe.
But in general, I think in terms of NATO troops direct under NATO command, across the region, there will be, I think, an additional up to 40,000.
The existing U.S. troop level in Poland, at last I heard a few days ago, was 5,000.
5,000 U.S. troops.
But in terms of the NATO presence, it's now going to be up to 40,000 soldiers.
In Poland?
No, in this sort of NATO region across the
from the
which
Baltics,
is a tremendous increase in what it was before.
Yeah, that's a big
the point.
And I think it would be folly to look at NATO troops as being one-to-one parity with Russian troops. Russian troops, and especially conscripts, are not motivated, not well trained, not well equipped, and certainly
that's a good point.
The parity is against Ukrainian partisans 10-1. So is it that same type of thing? Does a force of 40,000 NATO equal a force of 400,000 Russian untrained conscripts? Maybe.
I think you put those 10,000 Fort Bragg types onto 100. They're with 100,000 Russians, easy.
And with better training.
With their equipment.
And one of the points is, when it comes to training, and this is
if they have air cover.
But this is very important, and this is something which, of course, the Ukrainians have been able to use. But NATO training is very much that you give the local man who's doing the fighting, or woman, but more likely man, discretion to do things, and that's the NATO command structure. It works like that. The actual decision making is taken much closer to the battlefield. The Russians, of course, have never done that because everything orders come from the top. So they solely, A, they're conscripts, many of them. B, they don't want to be there. C, they don't know where they are anyway. They're badly trained, badly equipped, but they also are not taught to show any discretion on the battlefield.
They've been untrained and lied to.
Yes, exactly. So they are no match, of course, for Ukrainians. Who are defending their homeland.
And who've been
Will, can I weigh in here?
Since 2014.
Also underfed, yes.
Yes?
Yes. I think Phil alluded to a very important point in that the new military paradigm, which we are seeing, which we have seen unfolding in Ukraine, is that in today's warfare, the number of ground troops is oddly irrelevant. And that it is the ability to destroy the enemy's troop transports and supporting tanks, which is the key to slowing down an advance, so that you can see a Sparta-like force of 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers holding off a 10,000-strong Russian pincer movement from the north, because the ability of the NLAWs, the British NLAWs, and the U.S. Javelins has literally laid waste to the Russian troop transport and tank convoys. And we're also seeing that we've entered now phase 2 of the Russo-Ukrainian war, in that the Russians have seen that they cannot advance onto Kiev because it's too well defended, and none of their traditional ways of advancing on a city are working. Therefore, they are consolidating their gains in the east and in the Luhansk, Donbass areas, which they can comfortably control. So this is why I believe that this is Putin's off-ramp. This is his way of saving face with the Russian people, and also of, in effect, creating a rump Ukrainian state from Kiev and to the west, and controlling everything to the east of the Dnipro, and consolidating his gains in the south, with the possible exception of Odessa, because if the Russians were to take Odessa, this would leave Ukraine, or the new rump state of Ukraine, as a landlocked nation, which would badly impair their transportation facilities.
Yes, and do you think, what do you think that Ukraine, if you were in, that's what I want to ask you, if you were in charge of the Ukrainian army, what would you do now as the Russians begin to concentrate on the east, if in fact they are withdrawing or not just reconstituting, then coming back towards Kiev? What would you do about this movement toward the east?
There's not much that the Ukrainians can do with the Russian eastward transition of their forces. The idea now is to resupply their existing defenses in Kiev, to try to create some sort of defensive line protecting Odessa, and to make sure that they are receiving enough replacement javelins, NLAWs, and other defensive as well as attacking missile weaponry, because this will be instrumental in holding off the Russians. And I don't think that Putin, given his ragtag Keystone Cops military operations, are going to be able to penetrate the Ukrainian forces that have protected Kiev thus far. I mean, Putin's only option would be to conduct a type of carpet bombing on Kiev, and I'm not so sure he's willing to do that, because that surely would invite NATO to give Ukraine at least another 50 or 100 more airplanes, because thus far the Ukrainians have managed to keep their air force largely intact, and they are shooting down a number of MiGs and Sukhois. I mean, what would be ideal is if somehow you could train the Ukrainians to operate F-35s or even the F-16s and F-15s to defend the skies. But then again, the Russians can resort to cruise missiles instead of aerial bombardments on Kiev. So I think we've reached a stasis field around Kiev and the western part of Ukraine, and it'll be interesting to see how, to what extent NATO and the US is willing to rearm and amplify the type of weaponry available to the Ukrainian armed forces, which have done a brilliant job in the face of Putin's demonic army.
Yes, very good comment. Thank you, Harold. I want to throw something over to you, Philip, because this is something we were talking about before, is what might be the movements from Belarus, and particularly from the area of Brest, their new developments there in the last few days. They did this pullback supposedly from Kiev, although they're still putting in missiles and they're shelling with artillery. Outskirts of Kiev, apparently, and other cities in the area, Cherkiv and Kharkiv, Chernihiv, is that right? Yeah. And what do you think this means? What do you think the Belarusians are going to do? And what do you think it means for them to come right over the border of Poland and start the Russians putting missiles on their airport there at Brest?
I think it's a few aspects of that we need to look at. First off, is
okay, we got about 4 minutes
the
to
Belarusian
do it, so
army
lead us into the break.
Has allegedly refused to cooperate with orders to march on Ukraine. We've also seen some partisan activity insofar as sabotage of rail network is concerned in Belarus to prevent support for the Russian army further south. Russian army has...
By Belarusians are
yes,
doing
Belarusian
that.
rail types or partisan types. I'm not sure. Or it could have been Ukrainians inside Belarus. We just don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Belarus there's the fortress there at Brest, quite a significant 19th century fortress, but it's been traditionally a point of defense against or to stage armed forces, and what we see not necessarily in the 19th century fortress.
Because it's a 19th century forces, so
yes.
armed forces, including armored forces later, that's where you got.
But what we see in the
yeah.
area of Brest are
Yeah.
rockets and missiles attacking further south,
Yeah.
and potentially a staging area to have Russian troops move further south along the Polish-Ukrainian border to try to cut off Ukraine from aid coming in from Poland.
Right.
So coming south from the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, the first major crossing we see is really Hrebenina. That's the straight shot from Lviv to Lublin to Warsaw. A large crossing, maybe not a major crossing, but certainly not insignificant. If Hrebenina crossing were to be cut off from access to Lviv, then we're suddenly pushing more and more through we're pushing the same amount through fewer channels, or we're trying to push more through fewer channels. So I don't think it really affects us too much with the crossing at Korchovo, which is the main A4 highway where lots of aid is going through on trucks, but or that at the Medica crossing where we have lots of train exodus insofar as refugees are concerned. That's the direct rail shot from Lviv to Przemysl, and also further points in. There had been hospital trains going to Rzeszów from Lviv,
yeah.
but then what happens if they continue south and take over, for example, Korchovo? Or
You mean if the Belarusian, I mean, my point is, do you think the Belarusian troops are going to come in? We know that the rockets are there in Brest. This is a new development in the last week. We're pulling back. So my thought was they're pulling back in Kiev. Yet they're establishing a presence right on the Polish border at the corner of Belarus and Poland and Ukraine.
My question is,
that's what I thought was
how loyal
interesting.
are the Belarusian troops to Putin? Because we saw a few years ago a significant rebellion in Belarus that was quashed.
That's a good question.
But that doesn't mean that the undercurrents of rebellion don't remain.
Let's come back. We'll get out on the Encyclopedia Britannica and read all about Belarus in the break. So we'll have a longer break, but we'll have to share duties of reading the encyclopedia. Okay, Harold, we'll be back after this short commercial break with Harold von Kursk in Estonia. Thank you, Harold, and with Nicholas Richardson. Talking about NATO and other things, also a newsreader here at the station, and for Poland Daily, actually. And with Philip Goss, who is doing great things as an aide liaison. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. We'll see you after the break, and we appreciate you watching. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the show. And really appreciate you watching. Please, if you enjoy the show, share this with one and all. Share it with your friends. Go to YouTube and subscribe, or you can go to our Facebook page. There's a will. And may I plug also Poland Daily Travel, which is my travel show, which is on YouTube. Simply look up Poland Daily Travel, or on Facebook. Subscribe on YouTube, and just like us on Facebook, and you'll get the latest things from my travels around Poland with Vova, my cameraman. Exciting adventures we have. The last one being a trip up to the Suwałki Corridor.
The Suwałki Corridor, yes.
Yes, the Suwałki Corridor, which is very interesting. We might talk about that a bit later. But there was an interesting question in the break that Harold had, and I want Harold to come back in with your question about because I shared this question, this interest in this observation that you made, I made myself when reading the press accounts from MI6, the MI6 past chief about what's going on in the Russian military. So take it over, Harold, with your question.
Yes, well, just scanning every available piece of information that I've been able to dig up in the last 2-3 weeks, it seems that the British intelligence services are offering much more, cogent and compelling and incisive analysis as to what's happening inside the walls of the Kremlin, Putin's inner circle, than the American intelligence services and military advisors seem to be providing, at least what I've been able to see thus far. And I was wondering if Nicholas has any observations as to why this may be so.
I suspect that they have very similar intelligence, because it goes with this Five Eyes project with New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. They do share a lot of military intelligence. It could also be the fact that, rather unusually, the British intelligence services are now actually going public more with what they know, and the Americans may be doing less. And I think also there is the British government uses intelligence in a slightly different way. I mean, both countries, I'm talking about the United Kingdom and the United States, have a thing called the Joint Intelligence Committee. And it's made up of people, the military, the secret services and so forth, who gather information. Now, the British produce a weekly report for the Prime Minister, which is essentially a digest of everything they've learnt. And it comes to some conclusions. So that's very useful. The American one is rather different. They say, Mr. President, the Navy thinks this, the Air Force thinks this, the CIA thinks this, and there's much less attempt to tie it all together as a sort of usable piece of intelligence. So the president, whoever he or she is on the day, is then left with sort of 5 different opinions as to what's going on. So it could be that the presentation of the material everybody has allows the British to say a bit more. But I think that is something new from this war, the amount of intelligence which the government, in this case MI6, is actually sharing with the wider world.
But I think it's important to recognize that just because one government happens to appear to be sharing it, they aren't necessarily the source. Furthermore, how much of this intelligence sharing is indeed misinformation? I know there's a significant amount of misinformation from all sides. So maybe the answer is not that we're learning intelligence, but that we're receiving a message they want us to hear.
Indeed. One point I would make, of course, which will amuse all of us slightly, is that the general in charge of the French military intelligence has been sacked because he didn't predict any war at all. So well done, the French.
He didn't predict any?
No, so he has been, you can check, he has been sacked for not actually, for telling President Macron there would be no war.
I got another question I wanted to bring, idea I wanted to bring up. At what point are we getting used to this war? And not only us, but the Ukrainians. And, human beings are endlessly adaptable. And I want to say, for example, as an extreme example, that during the Warsaw Ghetto, right up until, that was a Jewish ghetto, of course. We know that, but some people might not. Right up until the end of the Warsaw Ghetto, they were holding parties, dancing parties, and baking birthday cakes and things like this, right up until the end of this.
You're right. Human beings are immensely adaptable.
So are we? At what point do you get used to this? I always think of a catch-22, where there's a war going on, all these crazy things. Everybody's trying to profit, and their egos are. People are still people.
Part of the problem, we live in an age where there's this 24-hour news cycle, and there's always something new, and people just get the stories move on. I mean, it was rather bizarre. We started the last section with this Will Smith in Hollywood and this stupid, inconsequential action.
Well, it wasn't inconsequential because
but only Americans think that what goes on in Hollywood is at all of interest to anybody else. So it's this sort of celebrity culture we seem to have developed. But I
love the English attitude to not worshipping celebrities, and English celebrities' attitude. The English celebrities' attitude is like that too.
But I think there's a more serious point when we talk about getting used to. If you take Poland, particularly, people have been very generous. And they've opened their homes and then, to use the phrase you see, opened their homes and hearts to Ukrainians. That's fine. And in the early days, people came and people took them into their homes. What I think we have to be aware of is there will come a point, no matter how charitable people are, having another family living in your house.
Yes.
If it's your relatives living in your house for more than a week or two, that gets a bit trying. If it's a family of strangers, no matter how charitable you wish to be. And the question is, do we have the structures in place to help folk move out of essentially strangers' homes into some more permanent accommodation?
And that becomes a European-wide effort. I think it is impossible to expect Poland to be able to receive and settle over 2 million people seamlessly. However, we did see a lot of people leave Poland. When Poland did enter the EU, many moved to, say, Southampton or any place else in the EU. But in any case, we have vacancies in Poland, let's just call them. And so there is room for people to settle. And there are things for people to do here, whether it's in agriculture, which Ukrainians are quite experienced at, or other things. But what we see, however, in this influx are women and children, not able-bodied farmers, for example. So
You're saying men, not men. You're saying it's women and children and not
the
men.
men are staying to fight.
The men are staying to fight.
And the men with-
Let's call a spade a spade.
And the farmers Phil talks about with their tractors are kidnapping Russian tanks. So
Which is
rightfully so, yes.
I think, again, it goes back to the point a few minutes ago, whether how much we can trust intelligence. And at one point, which is very interesting, is the Ukrainian sort of media performance during this war has been absolutely fantastic. They've really been on the ball.
They've been pretty accurate. They haven't really been over the top.
But when you read that the Ukrainian army now has more tanks than it started the war with, I mean, that's quite...
They have more tanks. That's
quite
and
incredible.
something like 500 Russian tanks destroyed. That's a lot of material.
Russians just abandoning the tanks.
Well, a lot of them, they're just running away and they're getting destroyed later.
As we said earlier, they're untrained, they have no morale, they're badly looked after, they're not fed.
What kind of monster puts people in the 21st century into this position?
But this was always the Russian way. It was the same under Stalin. It didn't matter. I have hundreds of thousands of people. I don't care how many die because I can always send more.
Well, of course we know that, but I'm just saying this is 21st century. Anyway,
there was a story last week of the Ukrainian grandmother who fed a number of Russian soldiers who came to her looking for food, and of course she poisoned it and killed 8. Poisoned the food, killed 8 soldiers. The rest of them...
More of that can be used. That's the old Russian. That's the Russian technique.
I mean, that's
turned
always,
about on them.
I mean, that's a technique which we even to a certain extent.
I know what we should talk about. Speaking of poisoning, because we were talking about this in the break, and we haven't spoken about it yet. And there's all this crazy business around Chernobyl. I've been to Chernobyl about 15 years ago, or more, I mean 15 or 16. Wrote an article. Look, you go from Kiev, it takes about an hour and a half to get there, so it's an easy day trip. As we know from the war, it's only 60, 70 kilometers from, and maybe it's 100, from Kiev, 60, 70 miles.
And it's relatively very close to the Belarusian border.
Yeah, and it's radioactive in certain places and certain places not. When you go on the tour, and I went in the early days when not many people were doing this, and when you go on that tour, you find that they are taking a Geiger counter and checking all the time, just in case there's some rogue radioactivity about. But during our time is where we went, and there was none of that. And we went very close, within reasonable distance of 100 meters of the factory, the place that was shut down. And the radioactivity was low there because it's been sealed, concreted off. It was a French project to do it. All right. Now, here's no. It took a long time. They put a sarcophagus on it, and that finally stopped all the radiation. They say. But anyway, the Geiger counters were safe, so you could go and visit at that point. But now, the Russians came through and they went through the forest they call the Red Forest. I wonder why. Because the dust is radioactive, and they kicked up the dust with their tanks and troops marching, etc., going all through this, and how many soldiers are now ill.
Worse. What's really was when they started digging trenches, of course.
And they dug trenches.
You're really disturbing the soil, and you're getting...
We saw 7 busloads of Russian grunt troops, basically, taken back into Belarus, all with acute radiation poisoning. And this just goes to underline exactly what we see time and again,
basically.
How the Russian attitude towards grunt soldiers is such that they are all cannon fodder, they are not fed properly, not trained properly. go to the radioactive forest and dig a hole. What could possibly go wrong? Well, this is what goes wrong.
And they didn't even know, those soldiers, did they, about that there had been a nuclear explosion in the reactor there. A lot of them said, we had no idea. We didn't even know where we were.
I think it goes back to show how consistent Russian, Soviet, however we call it, authority has been in flying in the face of what is ultimately 18th century philosophy. They do not follow any type of social contract with the people of their country.
That's a good point. That's that underpins everything.
There has never been an enlightenment in Russia. For whatever scientific and technological capabilities they have, it remains an unenlightened society.
Yeah, and that's right, because it was still under quite stringent despotism with Catherine the Great in the 18th century. So while the Enlightenment was taking place across Europe, there was no social, the social contract. Was it Montesquieu? Was a social contract?
Locke.
Locke was a social contract, and this was being organized and revolutionizing the Western
Which,
Europe.
of course,
Russia.
which is why Catherine the Great, of course, was so upset by the Polish 3rd of May 1791 Constitution, because this was seen as being dangerously revolutionary.
Yes,
in the age of Europe ruled by, with the exception of the United Kingdom, of course, of despotic monarchs.
Yeah, but not only that, but the French Revolution had also upset her a little bit, you know, because as Phil has said, this is the central point. And also Harold alluded to this as well, just this kind of regimentation of the society.
When we look at American versus European history, and then European Western versus Russian history, we see the ending of slavery in the U.S., the same as the freeing of the serfs in Europe,
at
where
the same time,
they were no longer bound to the land,
in Russia,
bound to the ownership. However,
1865, wasn't it?
But in Russia, it rarely never occurred.
Yeah.
Up through the Bolshevik Revolution, and then even afterwards, they became beholden to the system.
Yeah.
And so they simply changed one master for another.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's worth talking about the underpinnings, the philosophical underpinnings of all of this. Can I say underpinnings? Is that all right?
Yes, you may say that, yes.
Does that sound okay? And
you obviously can, but you may.
Does it make sense is the point. Anyway, I mean, you ought to be able to put these discussions on a level that any a 10-year or 11-year-old can understand, if you're doing it right.
I mean, what I think is an interesting question, I'm sure many are asking it, is to what extent Putin actually really knows what's going on. It seems clear, or more than likely, that he's not being told how badly his soldiers are performing.
Harold, what do you have to say about that? And then jump in, Phil, because you save your thought. Harold, let's bring Harold in. What do you think about the state of Vladimir Putin right now and the people surrounding him?
Well, the most interesting thing is that we simply do not know. We don't know to what extent he exists in his own information bubble reality distortion field. We don't know if he reads foreign news media. We don't know if his advisors and most close-knit people within his inner circle are giving him accurate accounts of what the losses are in Ukraine. I somehow cannot imagine that Putin is being treated with such kid gloves that he isn't aware of Russian losses, that he isn't aware that the Ukrainians have beat back the Russians from all the northern towns, the towns north of Kiev. I'm quite sure that he is aware of those things. I think that obviously when information is brought to him, the people may be bowing or otherwise trying to, let's say, minimize things by saying that, oh, eventually, of course, we'll crush the Ukrainians. But I think this latest so-called strategic shift, or as the Russians termed it, the end of their initial phase of the denazification of Ukraine, which of course is a laughable, risible notion in itself, that now Putin must be I think, thinking of how he is going to consolidate his gains and whether he is going to propose some sort of North Korea, South Korea division, which will partition Ukraine, much the same way that Pakistan and India and Bangladesh were divided, and which has happened many times throughout history. But I do think that Putin knows that things are not going well, and I think that this will eventually make him come to the negotiating table in some form, and that we will find a way out of this, what is looming as an eternal guerrilla trench warfare a la the 21st century.
All right, Harold, jump. Thank you, Harold. Jump in there, Phil.
I respectfully disagree with it. Just a couple of points there, and that is this. I think that Putin will not approach any negotiating table in good faith. I think the rest of the world understands that, and especially Zelensky understands this. No Putin approach to negotiation comes with good faith. Last time, they tried to poison the negotiators. So maybe we're done negotiating.
You mean the ones who are on the line,
at the Belarusian border, yes.
I remember saying, I wouldn't go over there and sit in a room and talk to those guys after what they're doing. Well, and then their faces started peeling.
Really that one of the ones who's allegedly poisoned was Abramovich, of course, who everybody who's used to probably still technically does own Chelsea Football Club. And everybody said, oh, he's Putin's man. And then when the sanctions first came in, they said, no, he's not Putin's man at all. And lo and behold, he pops up as a negotiator. And still, it does. And even if he assumes he's Putin, it doesn't stop somebody trying to poison him. Probably so.
Yes, but these poisoning reports are not confirmed. No. We don't know if we can take them seriously or not.
I think not taking them seriously is foolhardy. I'm sorry.
Foolhardy?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in any case,
why do you think that?
Because we see time and again evidence that the Putin regime acts in bad faith, and whatever they claim, we don't want to invade, and then they invade. It's always a lie. It's always a false operation. And so I think the time for negotiation has come and gone with that regime.
Well, then what do you propose? You're proposing that there's going to be eternal warfare in Ukraine?
No, I'm proposing
at least for the next
defeat,
year, 2 years?
Harold. I think it's naive to think that we do not defeat Russia completely and move for a regime change there in Belarus.
I never suggested that we're going to defeat Russia. I suggested that Putin's military losses are such that he will simply be brought by force majeure.
But there's another question to bring in, Harold, and when you say that we don't
Western Ukraine.
And there's some other interesting information, and that is that Putin does have cancer and that he doesn't have a future. This is why he's keeping distance from everyone, because he's afraid of catching any type of disease, whether it be COVID or not.
Flu, a cold, COVID.
Yes, because his cancer treatment means his immune system has been compromised. So here's a person with no future.
How do we know that that's true? I mean, I've heard that too. You've heard that. How do we know that's actually true? And it's been a rumor for some time.
That's been the digest from the various intelligence services.
Okay.
So because he is a man without a future, he really isn't doing anything other than to leave with a bang, let's just say. And so this is his swan song. Let's make it a good one.
Let's make a deal. Let's not make a deal. We could call this "Let's not make a deal."
And the question we don't know is to what extent those around Putin, and there are some around him, will actually say enough is enough. I mean, for the senior members of the FSB, the State Security Service, historically, since Putin has been in charge, have been all very well paid. They've been used to sending their families to holidays in Europe and all these sorts of things. They've enjoyed good accommodation. They've enjoyed all the benefits. And this has suddenly been cut off for them. Well, I'm talking about the oligarchs, which are a different...
when you can't pay off the boys...
I'm not talking about the oligarchs, which are a different category of person. I'm talking about the people immediately around him who have been deliberately so, a bit like the Praetorian Guard, have been well looked after.
Or the Godfather.
And now they, find their children can't go to school in Europe, they can't go to Disneyland, they go to the cash machine and they can't get money out. And there'll be enough of these people who will be thinking, well, hang on a minute, this is we are used to the good life, we don't like it.
And some of those generals are getting arrested and so forth. So
that's right, but I want to go back to, I think Harold raised a very good point, and it's one that catches in everyone's craw, if I can use the word craw. I'm using words, I keep asking permission. Is it okay?
No, not okay that you ask permission.
Do I have to take that back?
No,
you can't digest that word? Anyway, so if we go back, it's this idea, if you're Zelensky and you're the Ukrainian people, after witnessing everything that's happened, all the destruction and the kidnapping and the murder of civilians and the crimes that have gone on, the actual murder, not collateral damage by accidental bombing,
No.
but intentional running over citizens, shooting them,
Bombing hospitals.
burning their bodies to disguise the crime, bombing of hospitals, children's schools. It hasn't happened in a huge amount, but it has happened, and we know they were targeted. How can you put up with even some presence? You must be wanting to roll back that Russian presence to the bare minimum, and you must even be thinking, well, why don't we just take out their Navy and go get Crimea too? Why don't we starve them out for a change? I mean, at what point do you say, you know what, we've got nuclear weapons too? You got nuclear weapons, we've got nuclear weapons.
I think you make a...
We think ours work.
Yes.
How about yours? How about you set off a few of yours and they blow up Moscow by
Well, we're
accident?
back at the point which you and I have discussed on this program and elsewhere on many cases. It's a question of willpower. We're allowing ourselves...
They need a lot more willpower.
Yes, they need more willpower.
I heard a general say that.
Yes. But
He
the
said
point is,
they need more will.
But we've got, if every time Putin says, oh, I'm going to set off my nuclear weapons, we'll go, and run away, then he can just say, I'll take the Baltic states and Poland.
Yes, I know. Where does it stop?
We have them too. Stop.
Interestingly,
yes, and ours work.
Regarding
right?
willpower,
Okay.
when John Paul II 40 years ago said, "Nelenkajcie, don't be afraid to act," and that involves a certain amount of hope. And so here is Mark Brzezinski quoting John Paul II and talking to Poland and Ukraine and saying, don't be afraid to act. Do hold hope. And I think that that's an important thing to remember here, is that we have hope, we have the ability to act, and also that Putin, given his medical situation, has no future. So to have him saving face with no future is simply the wrong way to look at it.
Thank you, gentlemen, in the studio. Philip Goss and Nicholas Richardson, I forgot his name. It's the same as mine. And, of course, Harold von Kursk, our continuous correspondent in the Baltics. Thank you, gentlemen, for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
I wish we could go on for another hour because there was still plenty to talk about.
A lot.
Anyway, plus our impressions of what's been going on over the last year. We'll do that in the next show. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. That's all we've got from There's a Will. Take care, and I might say, you're looking well.